Okay, we're going to start where we stopped last time. We were going to talk about outsider art. So we had been talking about artistic training, how artists are trained in the past and how they're trained nowadays. And at least from the 19th century and probably even earlier than that, and we just have very little information, there have always been artists who have either taught themselves the word or the phrase outsider art or an outsider artist means art that was made by a person that wasn't trained in a school or an apprentice system, any of the usual ways of being trained. And sometimes it means that they actually rejected that formal sort of training because they felt like they had something another way they wanted to create art, something they wanted to say that couldn't be said the best way, by using just the style that was current at the time. And one of those, one artist that's like that is this artist. His name is Henri Rousseau. He was a minor official in the customs office in France in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century. And he began to paint as a hobby, just because he was interested in painting. And then he got more involved with it, and he began to go to museums and go to exhibits of art and really study how people were painting, how they were creating the art. But he never formally took any classes, and so he didn't understand entirely some of the techniques that were used. For example, if you look at this, he understood that looking at traditional art of the 19th century, that they used highlights like you see on the edge of this arm, and they used shadows in order to make figures that look three-dimensional. And so he began to do that. He began to practice that technique. And the thing was that he didn't understand entirely how it was done at this time. And so, for example, here you tend to have just a really bright edge on that arm, and then all the rest of the arm is in this really deep sort of shadow, and it really almost makes that highlighted area there stand out like it's a white line, that he sort of outlined the forms with. And then if you look at, he has that same sort of white line here with a shadow, but then, where does the light come from right here in this work? He didn't understand that at this period of time, artists were using this treatment of light, the lights and the shadows that you see here, in a very consistent way, that they always came from one direction, and anything that was hit by this light, it always looked like it came from one direction, just like it really does, in nature. And so he made just a little bit of mistake, in how he treated light. And the same thing was true in other, things that he did, that he, because he self-taught himself, he didn't quite understand it. And so he came out with a style that was different from the styles that the artists had created. But he became very famous, very well known. The young artists that were working at this period of time sort of adopted him and encouraged him to keep creating art. And he finally created a series of paintings that were jungle paintings, such as you're seeing here with the Dream that we're looking at, where this woman reclining on a couch, seems to be in the midst of some sort of jungle that's inhabited by this person. There's actually a human being right here. It's a little hard to tell because his head sort of disappears into the foliage back here. But he's playing something, it looks sort of like a flute or like a recorder or something. And often there are other animals, and everything is treated with this very careful kind of detail so that you sort of get distracted. You can look at different parts of this work and you see just almost the same amount of detail as you see in other parts. And so it tends to sort of distract from the unity of the work because of all this detail that you focus on. And he made up a whole fictional story about why he painted these jungle paintings. He had served in the Army, and he said that while he was in the Army that he had spent time in Mexico, and that that's where all of this sort of tropical kind of foliage came from. But we have no record at all. Art historians who have studied him have tried to find records that show that he actually went to Mexico. We can't find any records. And so it's assumed today that probably he didn't go to Mexico. And more than likely, since he lived in Paris, what he did was he went to the botanical gardens in Paris, where you see a lot of this exotic sort of tropical foliage. And that he probably went there and studied the foliage there and made copies of it. He probably went to the zoological gardens to make copies of birds and other animals that he depicts in his work, and then created this sort of fantasy image that you see here. He thought of himself as a great artist, but at the same time he understood that he was doing something that was somehow different from what was being done usually, and he was very proud of that because he wanted to be this independent sort of artist. And later on, he had an influence on artists in the 20th century that were sort of interested in fantasy sort of art, and they looked to him as an example of how you create a fantasy sort of art. So he's just one example of a number of artists, that have been untrained, that have become rather famous in art history because of the style of art that they've created. And let me just, for a minute, talk to you about the word style and what that means. It means a set of characteristics that an artist continually uses. You might think of a personal style that an artist has as being like personal handwriting. Each of us has a slightly different kind of handwriting. We all write in a general sort of way, in a similar way to each other, but people that really study handwriting can usually distinguish between one person and another. Well, that's what a style is, particularly a personal style. Every artist develops a slightly personal style, but at the same time that they develop this personal style, their style still fits within a larger context. There may be a series of artists that they live around and they all paint with similar characteristics. And when that happens, we often talk about that being a school style. And we don't mean that they all went to the same school and learned how to paint. We just mean that they associate with each other. They observe the kind of art that each other are doing, and so they end up developing similar characteristics in their work. And then we also, in art history, talk about historical styles. And when we are talking about that, or sometimes we call them period styles, there we're talking about that all the artists at a period of time, like in the 19th century or the 20th century, will have certain similarities in their type of art that they're producing. And the same thing is true, we can talk about cultural styles. And there we usually mean that, artists are responding to similar kinds of stimuli in the culture. And so they tend to produce something that's slightly similar. So there are a number of different ways that we refer to style in art. And it means, basically that there's a consistent set of characteristics that the artists are using that allow us to define them in certain ways, either by schools or by periods or by cultures. Okay, just a minute. My computer is not moving. Let's try it again. Okay. Now, another common assumption that people often have about art, and I've encountered it with graduate students that have studied here in this art department, is that art is supposed to be beautiful. And the problem with that kind of assumption is that, and it is an idea that developed in the 19th century and 18th century, And I'll talk a little bit about why in a minute. But the problem is that, not everyone defines beauty in the same way. You may find someone, the guys may find one girl beautiful and not another, and maybe somebody else finds that other girl beautiful. So we have different definitions of beauty. And of course it works for girls with guys also, that some girls like one guy, some girls like another guy. And the same thing is true of art. Different periods have found different things beautiful in the art. So, if you make sort of a broad statement, well, I know what I like and I like it to be beautiful. If it's not beautiful, it's not art. And that is a comment that a graduate student said to me one time. And I was sort of surprised because you really expect artists to be a little bit more broad-minded than that. But this, the problem is, well, how do you define that beauty? What may be beauty to you is not necessarily beauty to another. The place where it occurred or it grew up was in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And it grew up in relationship to aesthetics. Aesthetics, and that's spelled Aesthetics. 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 Aesthetics began in the 18th century as a branch of philosophy. And there were philosophers in the 18th century who began to discuss how is beauty defined? What makes something beautiful? And one of the examples that they gave in trying to figure this out was art. Why do some people think that one piece of art is beautiful and not another piece of art? And so that began a discussion that has continued into the 20th, 21st centuries. In the 20th century, the definition of aesthetics was broadened more, and it began to be used as a way of just discussing about art. And it wasn't specifically always related to beauty. It was broader than that. But that's where beauty got connected with art, and where this assumption developed that art should be beautiful. And so, I'm showing you here an example of a still life. And, some of you may think, yeah, you think it's beautiful. Other people may not think it's beautiful. There are lots of reasons why you may think it's beautiful. Some of you may think, well, I just like the way that the color is treated, or I like the way the forms are treated, or I like fruit, so I think fruit is, I like fruit, so fruit is beautiful to me. So there are lots of different ways of, looking at beauty. And just to give you a few examples of how this has worked in art, in the Renaissance period, this is a work by Botticelli of the Birth of Venus. And in the Renaissance, people would have said that this was a very beautiful work of art. And there are lots of reasons why. The men might have said, well, I really think that nude figure of Venus is beautiful, and I like it. And, a lot of nudity in art, particularly female beauty and nudity in art, was to appeal to men, because men were the purchasers, usually. They were the ones with the money, and they purchased the art. And so that might have been the reaction of some early Renaissance men of, they thought that this female figure is very beautiful, and so they liked it. But other persons might have said, well, I really like the way he's treated the color. I like those sort of light colors, what we would probably call pastel sort of colors today. So they might have said that. Someone else might have said, well, it's the message. It's what this is all about. That's what I find beautiful. And what the message is, this is supposed to be, as the title says, the birth of Venus. Venus is the goddess of love. and she's the Roman version of the goddess of love. But Roman mythology, for the most part, comes from Greek mythology. And in Greek mythology, they believed that Aphrodite, or Venus, was born fully grown out of sea foam, and that she floated onto her island on a seashell. And so Sandra Botticelli has shown her on a seashell. This figure right here is blowing wind, and he is Zephyrus. He's the god of wind in Greek mythology, and he's blowing wind that's blowing her towards this island where she's going to live. And so, some people in the Renaissance who were educated and intellectual, maybe they would say, I really like Greek mythology. I really like that story about how she was born. And, they might say, and he did such a good job of representing that. And, that would be why they really appreciated it. So even during one cultural period, there might have been many different reasons why people would have said it was beautiful. And in the very next period, about 200 years from when this was painted, not even quite 200 years, when another artist painted, he might have treated beauty in a very different way. He might not have thought, just a minute, I want to go back, because I was just thinking about something and then I didn't mention it. If you look at this figure, just as a later artist 200 years ago might have said, that's not beautiful to me, I ask you, you think she's particularly beautiful? Are those the proportions that we think of as beautiful today in our culture? She's awfully elongated. She has kind of a heavy abdomen and heavy thighs down there. Her head's very small. Think about the kinds of, and you can think about it, male, female beauty, kinds of people that we call beautiful or that are thought of as being beautiful today by some people, not everybody. And I don't know that it fits very well into that particular view of beauty. And just in terms of females, we have about 3 different definitions of female beauty today. There's the model. I think the fashion model probably comes the closest to being similar to her, except this Venus has too wide hips to really be a fashion model. But, the tall, slender, often with, rather small heads for the proportions of their body. That's sort of one kind of beauty that we have. Then there's sort of the Dolly Parton type, or who is that lady that was in Baywatch? Yeah, Pamela Anderson type, big breasts, sort of the hourglass figure. That's sort of another type that some people think is beautiful. Then there's sort of just the ordinary people, most of us, So, we don't have any one definition of female beauty, and we don't have it for male beauty either. Again, we could talk about, the athlete or the bodybuilder. We could talk about the model once more. There are many different definitions. And that was certainly true, in the history of art also. Then another problem is, what do you do if you want to show something that isn't beautiful? But you're an artist, and you think it's really important that I make an image of this to tell people about. And maybe you're upset, about it. Here we're looking at a work of art that was created by Francisco Goya. He was a Spanish artist in the late 18th, early 19th century. He lived through a time in Spain when Spain was occupied by French troops of Napoleon. And he saw terrible things happen. The French starved the Spanish people. They killed them. They tortured them. And that's what's happening here with this man. And, he said, I need to tell people about this. I need to, and this is before photography. And so how's he going to record it if he doesn't make images of it? I want to tell people the awful things that happen in Spain, maybe so that it'll prevent them from ever happening again. Sort of like the photography of the Holocaust that many of us have probably seen in classes. And so he created this image. And, if he had even thought of this, he would have said, I can't create beautiful images because they won't get the point. If nothing violent or nothing really bad is happening in the image, how are they going to understand about what happened, in Spain? And so he created a whole series of images showing the starvation, showing the torture, showing the various battles that took place in Spain. There's a whole series of these that were made, and they're called, and I'll translate, The Disasters of the War. And this particular one, he gave the subtitle of Why. And it's like he's asking us, why? Why would this happen? Why would human beings do this to each other? We can't ever let this happen again. And it shows, 3 French soldiers. They're recognizable by the kind of uniforms that they're in. And they're torturing this man. He's got a noose around his neck. He's been tied to a tree. His arms are tied behind his back. And what most people think is happening here is he's being drawn and quartered. What they would do, in fact, I just heard somebody describe this on television a couple of days ago. They would hang people, but before they died, they would take them down, and then they would proceed to cut them open and take out their internal organs, and at some point they died, because of that. And then they were cut up into pieces, and they were dragged through the street. And the heads were usually put on a pole, for other people to stare at. And it was a warning, don't do what this guy did, or this is what could happen to you. Well, Goya is creating something that I think is very valid to create in art. It's not something I would hang on my wall, something at home where every day you stared at it. I'm not sure I'd want that. But nevertheless, it's very valid to use art to create this message and say, don't let this happen again. Look what horrible thing it was that happened. And he doesn't, he thought about not only are the images not going to be pleasant to look at, and I'm going to exaggerate, the pain on the face of this man, but I'm also not going to use color, because he understood that color often attracts people. People like certain colors. And so what if he used a color that, a lot of people said, oh, I just love that color. They might not see the image. And I'll give you a 20th century example of that in a minute. And so he, doesn't want to use color. He wants to be very stark, very black and white. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's not beautiful, so it breaks that assumption, that art has to be beautiful, but it's very valid, to create that kind of art. The thing I was thinking about was Andy Warhol, who's a pop artist in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. He made images of a electric chair. He just took a photograph of an electric chair, and then he silk screened them. And he used different colors for each of the repetitions of the electric chair. And he made wallpaper out of this. And I was at a conference one time where an art historian was talking about that she was invited to somebody's house, and that she was sitting at the dinner table and she was eating, and she glanced up at the walls and she thought, oh my, that's Andy Warhol's electric chair on the wall. And, she asked, her host, if he had noticed what the subject matter was, and he just looked, oh no, but isn't it a beautiful color? And then she said to him, that's an electric chair. You understand that's an electric chair that you have in your dining room, for people to stare at while they're eating? And he said, oh, but it's a Warhol. So, what Goya realized is if he just made this very beautiful, people might have said, oh, beauty, so beautiful, that color that he used. They might sort of miss the point of why he was doing it. So, art can be ugly at times, and there can be an important purpose why art is ugly. Now, another assumption that people sometimes make is, art should look real. And I have heard, people say, well, I don't know what it, I know what I like. I want it to look like something I can understand, something that looks like, something I can interpret because it's real. It's representational, in other words. And again, a lot of that idea comes from the past because in the Renaissance artists really emphasized creating techniques that would make things look very real, very representational. And that tradition, because the Renaissance artists were so admired by later centuries, that tradition just kept going down. Century after century, artists continued to create representational art. And this work certainly is real in that way. It shows us every bump, every little bit of cellulite in this woman's body. It shows us the details, the decoration on her garment she's wearing, all the details, on her vanity table. I mean, we really get a lot of reality. But if you ask a lot of people, well, do you like it then? It's real. And then they say, well, no, I don't like that. But it's real. You said you wanted art to be real. Oh, but I didn't mean that kind of reality. And I often point out to people that, I've asked in the past, in class, if people liked this because it was very real. And one time, most of the class said, no, they really didn't. And we talked about why. And then this one girl raised her hand and said, yes, I do like that. And so I asked her why, and she said, because it reminds me of my mother. Well, the idea, this is something familiar to her. She's remembering the love. She's remembering all the warm feelings that she had in her relationship with her mother. And so she sort of goes beyond the surface appearance, and she puts something else into it. But, if you're wanting reality, then, that's certainly reality. There are lots of different kinds of reality. There is the kind of reality that you see here, and this is sometimes what some people think when they say reality, and this is the kind they want. This kind of reality is called Trump oil, and I think I have it, phooey, I don't. Well, I'll spell it for you. Trompe, and then separate word, L''oeil. Trompe, and then separate word, L'oeil. That's a French phrase that means fool the eye. And in this kind of representation or reality, the appearance is so faithful to what the objects look like that sometimes you're sort of fooled. And this artist did like to fool people. And there are a number of artists that have done this, but I just chose this particular artist. In one of his works, not in this particular one, I don't have an image of the one where he did this. One of the nails that you're seeing here was a real nail. And then he painted on a shadow on that real nail. But everything else in the work was painted. It was not real. And it was like he was testing us, or it was like he was trying to fool us into figuring out what's real, what isn't real in this work. And he was able to do that because he had developed a style where he could really make things look very real. He could fool your eye. And when you first look, at it, you weren't sure, is that a real nail? Is that a painted nail? And you really had to look a little closer, to really figure out whether it was painted or not. So this is one kind of reality that some artists have created, this sort of fool the eye kind of reality. And then there's this kind of reality that many people think of when they're thinking about, art looking like reality or being very real in appearance. This work that you're seeing here on the right is by Raphael. He's an high Renaissance artist. And on the left, you're looking at a drawing that he did. And this is another kind of representation or appearance that is not really real. What he did was to abstract reality. He took what a figure looked like, what a woman looked like, and he turned it into a series of ovals. And you can see him doing that a little bit in this drawing. He's simplifying the figure, and so, you have this nice oval form for her head, and then it's as if he turned the oval on its side and made it larger to create the oval slope here of her shoulders. And then you can go down to the kids, and you can say, here's the oval once again, sort of elongated for the thigh here of this little boy. And so that's how he constructed his reality. But it's not really real. It doesn't look exactly like a real person would look at. And so we talk about this kind of reality as being idealization. And what idealization means, it means simplifying a real object that you're depicting, but simplifying it in a way to make it look like a more perfect object. Instead of taking one specific woman and copying her into a painting with, maybe a little something wrong with the proportions of her face, or maybe with a few bumps here and there in her body, you smooth down those bumps. You make the head look more balanced and more symmetrical. So you make her look more perfect than she really looked in reality. And that's what Raphael did. And so this is another kind of reality, an idealized sort of reality, and some people call it abstraction. And we'll get into what the definition is of abstraction here in a second. So, we have a number of different kinds of reality. So again, the problem with reality is that when somebody says, well, I know what I like and I want it to look real. Well, what do you mean? You want it to look idealized? Or do you want it to look like every bump? You want it to fool you, to be so real that you can't tell what's real and what isn't? Or do you want it to be a reality like this? This is a work by a very famous Japanese artist named Seishu. He was a Zen Buddhist monk. And this is his view of what reality is. This is a landscape that he painted. And to him, this was as real as, the trompe l'oeil work that we looked at, the fool the eye sort of work. And, I'm sure that if you look at it and you say, yeah, but where's all the detail? There is so much detail in the other work. How can he think this is real? Well, the reason is that particularly the Zen Buddhist monks are thinking in terms of the reality underneath things. They're not, they feel like superficial appearance of reality is not worth much. It's what's underneath it. It's what the true content of a thing is. That's the reality. It's not just what you look like on the outside. We might say that about a human being. It's not, there's a show on TV right now on one of the stations called True Beauty. And it's not about picking the most beautiful young person. It's about what they are inside, too. And that's sort of what Seishu was saying. And that's what a lot of Far Eastern artists have done in their work. They've tried to depict what they believe is the content inside. And so to him, this is as much landscape as something that was very detailed, that show you every detail of what the outer appearance of a landscape looks like. We've had the same kind, this is sort of what I call a symbolic reality. It doesn't symbolize the outer appearance, it's supposed to symbolize the inner appearance. And we've had something similar in European art in the past, in the Middle Ages, that we might call a symbolic sort of reality as well, although it is more representational. We see more details than we saw in Seychou's work that we were just looking at. These are statues on the front of a cathedral in France, Chartres Cathedral, which is just a little ways from Paris. And this was made during the very high point of the Middle Ages, during the Gothic period. And, you know, you could say, well, okay, they look like human beings, but take a look at them. They're all the same size. They're all rather thin. We don't really see much body underneath. And take a look at their faces. It looks almost like the same face, every single one of them. You know, a little bit different, but if you take a look at this man, and this man, except for little differences in the beard, they really look like the same people. And during the Middle Ages, they would have said, that's fine, because they were creating an art that was supposed to symbolize things and not just show us nature, not just show us, you know, what reality was. But the problem they ran into was, how do you teach people using these kinds of images if they all look the same? And so what they had to do was they had to give their statues objects to hold. And so, for example, this man is holding this plaque. So who would that be? Think about people from the Bible that have plaques. Moses, right. This person is a little bit less well known. He has a lamb in his hand and he has a knife to it. And some people think it represents Samuel. He was a prophet and a priest, but other people think it represents Melchizedek, who was a priest, also a rabbi in the Old Testament. This figure right here is holding a young boy, and the boy's arms are bound and his feet are bound, and the man has a large knife in his hand. Anyone know who that might be? Yeah, Abraham and Isaac. So they had to start giving these figures a little bit extra, a few details extra, an object, or they had to have another person with them or something, in order for the people, you know, the ordinary people that were seeing them every day, to tell who they were. So it was a symbolic sort of reality again. It's not depicting individuals, you know, each individual person. And we could understand who they are by that way. We have to understand what all the objects are that they're holding in their hands in order to understand who they are. Now, I said I would define for you what the term abstraction means. Abstraction means taking a natural object, something that you could see, you know, outside of your window, something recognizable, and then transforming it in some way. And maybe it's by distorting it, as you see here. We can still recognize this is a woman, but, you know, her face looks a little distorted. There's not every detail of her gown being represented for us. The hands look a little distorted. In abstraction is taking a natural object that you can still recognize. You can still say this is a man, or this is a woman, or this is a building, but somehow it's been transformed. It's been distorted as here, maybe simplified, taken out a lot of objects or details of that object, but it's still a natural object. Now, the next word I'm going to talk about is non-objective or non-representation. And that's what you see here in both these examples. You don't see anything recognizable. You know, you could look at something like this, and I've had students say, well, it looks like a city street or blocks of a city that have been represented. But just, take it from me because I know the artist. All he was trying to depict here were squares of color and squares that, were white. He was not trying to depict a city block, anything recognizable at all. For him, it was enough to just show you these squares of different colors, and actually they're only the primary colors. We'll be talking about that later. Red, blue, and yellow are primary colors, and that's all he would use. And there's a reason why. He explained in writings that he did, and we'll talk about that later because we'll be talking about him when we get to 20th century art. This is also a non-objective work. It's not meant to be anything but just dribbles of paint. We talked about this earlier and about how he made it by just pouring paint onto a canvas that he laid on the floor. So these that don't represent any natural object we can recognize are what we call non-objective, or another word for it's non-representation or non-representational, either one. Now what gets confusing for students is that when I show you the title for the drip painting here, the style is called abstract expressionism. So, that always confuses students because they say, well, okay, but they're using that word abstract. And I thought you told me abstract meant it had to have a natural form in it. The styles are often styles that people just come up with, and they don't do it based upon what they see in the work. Another name that has hit this artist's style has been called, instead of abstract expressionism, it's been called gestural expressionism. In other words, that his gestures have been used to create it. So this is just a title. It doesn't signify anything about whether there's a natural object in it or not. It's just the title of the style. So, the word naturalism or representation, or a lot of people say realism, all of those belong to, depictions that have lots of objects we can recognize, that have lots of detail in them. Then abstraction means you still got the natural object, but it's simplified or transformed somehow. And then these are non-objective, no natural object in them. So, just kind of get those down, because those are the kind of things I might ask on an exam. Okay. Now, another way of looking at art and certainly understanding it is to talk about its meaning. And in talking about the meaning that the artist has given to a work of art, you have to understand that understanding meaning is a cultural skill. It's something you have to learn. And if you live in a particular period of time, you're usually going to be able to understand it better than somebody living a lot later. And I'm using this as an example to talk a little bit about that. Here we can all understand, that we have a man and a woman. What they're doing, that's debatable. And that's where a cultural understanding, where an understanding of that period of time helps a lot. And in your textbook, in this chapter in your textbook, they define a number of terms, and I want to define that for you. And one of the terms they first define is something we'll talk about later in more detail. It's the word form. What form means, it means what is represented and how it's represented, meaning that we have a man and a woman, that they're represented fairly naturalistically, lots of detail, so we would call them naturalistically, or naturalistic. We could talk about the color used. Those are forms. Those are how this has been depicted. But that doesn't tell us anything about what it means. That is, it can help, but at this point we're not going to worry about how form can be used to help us with meaning. So in order to understand meaning, we have to think about the content. And there are sort of 4 steps in thinking about that. Okay, they were there. Let me get on. Let me see if, okay, yeah. I'll come back to the other one in a minute. You have to identify, you have to describe, you have to categorize, and you have to interpret. So identifying. What I mean by that is saying, there's a man and a woman, there's a dog, there's some shoes. You're not saying anything else about it, and you're not making any comment about whether it's good or bad or beautiful or not, or any of these other assumptions we've talked about. You're just identifying what's there. And this is called content, or it's also called iconography. That word means studying the subject matter. Icon is a word for image, and it's used in art history to mean the subject matter in a work of art. Graphy means study, so the study of the subject matter. So first of all, we have to know what's there. We just have to be able to identify what's there. Then the second step is to describe the things we see there. So then that's when we go into more detail, and we can say, well, here's the man. He's wearing some kind of cloak that has fur on the bottom. He has a hat on his head. He has a rather long nose. He's raised one hand up. It's a little hard to tell in this image, but he's standing in his sock feet, and these are his shoes right here on the side. Then we could describe the woman. And so now we're going into more detail. Then the next thing, after you've described all that, and you would probably say something about how the garments don't look contemporary. These look like old garments, or, these, seem to be different from what we would expect to see today. Then the next thing is, that gets us into the next step, which is called categorizing, and there we try to put it in its time. Okay, when did they wear things like that? We try to sort of figure out what period of time we're looking at. And once we've categorized it, once we put it into category, and in this instance, this is something from the early Renaissance in Northern Europe. Once we put it there, then we can go on and say, okay, now I know it's from Northern Europe. How do I interpret it? What's going on here? What's really happening here? And then you start looking at some of the details. Well, he's got his hand up. What does that mean? When do people have their hands up? Or taking an oath, when you're in court, they swear you in. What do? You raise your hand while they swear you in. And they're holding hands. Does that mean there's supposed to be some kind of relationship? Why does he have no shoes on? And also, she doesn't either. Her shoes are these little red things right here in the background. You begin to try to interpret. Why does he have no shoes on? And you think about, well, okay, and this is what art historians do when they're trying to figure things out. What happened in the early Renaissance in this northern part of Europe? What kind of symbols did they use? Well, we know that, when they had their shoes off, that they usually were standing on holy ground. So as you said, there's something holy happening. We don't know what exactly. But they're standing on, it's as if they don't want to soil, the ground. And in earlier periods, when they took off their shoes, it meant they were standing on holy ground. And we know that carried on into this period. And so then you look at some of the other details. Oh, there's a little dog here, a little wiry terrier sort of dog, standing, so he's overlapping her garment here. Again, we could just think of it as, well, it's just a dog. Okay, it's her dog. But actually, once you begin to think, now wait a minute, he's using symbols. Why is he using symbols? Are they all symbols? And again, you can make a connection. Dogs were often placed at the feet of women on tombstones when the women, they were wealthy enough to be depicted on their tombstones. And it always meant that the woman was faithful to her husband. And dogs in the Middle Ages were a symbol for faith, not just of husband and wife, but for, of faith in Christianity. Oh, okay, so we have another symbol. This is happening on holy ground. He seems to be taking an oath. There's some relationship there with them. Here's a little dog, meaning fidelity. There are also some fruit back here, and fruit, again, is a symbol from the Middle Ages. It often refers to fertility. And then you'll notice, and this is, a case of, remember I've talked about, you have to look at all those details. Up here in the chandelier, there's only one candle, and it's lit. No other candles. That, again, is a symbol that comes out of the Middle Ages. And so you begin to add, usually it means the all-seeing eye of God. It means God is presence. And so you begin to add up all these things, and one art historian decided, and not everyone agrees with him, I'll tell you that. And, this is a case where you're interpreting, and there can be different interpretations. One art historian decided this was a marriage that was possibly taking place. And, because of the emphasis on fidelity, the emphasis on it being a holy sort of event, like a holy oath he's taking, the relationship that's established between them. And so he decided this is either a betrothal or this is the actual marriage. And he noticed, and it's hard to tell here, but there is a mirror in the back, and we see the backs of these two people, and then beyond those backs, we see two more people, as if they're standing in a doorway. And he, from studying history, looking at documents, looking at the rules of the church at that time, he discovered that at this time, in this northern area of Europe, two people could marry each other without a priest being present because there weren't priests for every town. They would travel around to different towns. And so if you wanted to get married or you needed to get married in a hurry, you can marry yourself if you had two witnesses. And so there were the two witnesses. And then, of course, when the priest would come to town, then you go through the ceremony again, so that the church could bless the marriage. And so this one art historian, decided this was a marriage taking place. Now, not everybody else, has seen it that way. And he interpreted this as being the marriage bed that was being represented, and that they are standing in the marriage room where the marriage is going to be consummated. And I might mention, most people don't think she's pregnant. She looks pregnant. But notice she's pulled up her drapery. It's higher here in the front. And she's holding it up in front of her. And if you look at other art from this period, you see that there seemed to be at that time an interest on women. This was a part of what made them beautiful, if they had rather large bellies, large abdomens. And in fact, in some paintings, we see them standing, really sway back so they can really push out their bellies. And that was just a sign of beauty at that time. Another sign of beauty, and you don't really see it here in her, but if you look at the Mona Lisa, she has no eyebrows. They would shave their eyebrows. I would go right along with them today, since I have my eyebrow problem here. They would, to make a higher forehead. They thought very high foreheads were beautiful, so they would shave their eyebrows off to make their foreheads look higher. That was their interpretation of beauty. It wouldn't be ours, but, it was theirs. So some people, believe, and this particular art historian believed she wasn't pregnant. They were just getting married. Now, I will tell you that another interpretation that we know from what we know about this period, often if they were wealthy people or they were aristocratic people, the man would live with the woman until she got pregnant, and then he would marry her. Because back in those days, it was so important to have a child to pass on your inheritance to. And so to ensure that they would have a child, they would live together until she got pregnant, then they get married. And if after they lived together for a few years she hadn't got pregnant, then they'd throw her out and find somebody else. And so she might be pregnant, actually, but not everyone agrees. You know, some people think that she isn't pregnant. And other people disagree with this one art historian that made this interpretation. Another art historian found out from other documents she read that at this period of time, so few people had really nice beds with canopies like you see here in the background of this work, that sometimes they put the beds in their front rooms, you know, where all the visitors would come, because that way they could, it was a sign of their wealth. You know, people would come to visit them and they'd say, oh, look at your bed. You know, you've got a really nice bed. It was sort of a status symbol. And so this art historian, you know, has said this isn't the marriage chamber or bed chamber we're looking at. This is probably the, you know, the living room of the home. She still sort of went along with the idea that it's a marriage, but there are other interpretations been made of it. So anyway, you know, in trying to figure out what's going on, the subject matter, you have to go through these steps, you know, to try and figure out, and this is what an art historian does. This is what their job is, you know, to do that sort of thing. Now let me go back for just a second to content. Content, and if you've had English, you've heard this already, is the opposite of form. Form is what is there. It's how the artist has created the work. Content is what the form is about. It's the subject matter of the work. If you need to leave early, go out the back, okay, because you get in front of the cameras, okay? Okay. So content is what all of this is about. Content can be something very, you know, representational like you see here, where we can, you know, really go into lots of detail describing, you know, different objects and what's there. But content can also be in non-objective art, as you see here. And I talked about, you know, that this man that you see here on the right was not interested in making anything that would look representational. But that doesn't mean he didn't have content. Content is about what he's talking about in making that decision to show us only the primary colors and to show us only these squares. And without going into a lot of detail about it, what he was talking about was what the world is like, what life is. He looked at nature and he said, you know, all color is based upon primary colors. All color goes back to those primaries, red, blue, and yellow. And so he said, I want to show what's universal. I want to show what all of nature is like. So I don't want to show all those specific variations of color. I'm just going to give you the primaries. And then he also decided that if you looked at nature, it was composed of horizontals and verticals. You know, the horizon lines, horizontal, lines of mountains are horizontal, or lines of, you know, rivers. And then there are trees, you know, they're vertical. And he said, okay, so all you have to do is show the horizontals and verticals. And again, you're saying, here's what's universal about nature. Here's what's universal about life. But he's doing it in a non-objective way. He doesn't draw us a tree, you know, or a river or anything like that. So it does still have content, although it's not something that's easy to interpret. And I didn't, you know, I used to look at him when I was first starting out and studying art and thinking, well, okay, just a bunch of squares. Big deal. You know, I can do that. You know, what's so important about that? It wasn't until I started reading what he wrote about what he was doing that I understood what he was trying to do. You know, it becomes much more difficult to interpret it. And the same thing is true of works like this. You know, this is also non-objective, even though it has things that sometimes look a little bit like they relate to nature. This artist, and this artist is another artist from the early 20th century, a Russian artist named Kandinsky. He was all about expression and expressing his views about the spiritual quality of life, not what it looked like on the outside, but what it was on the inside. And this was just his way of showing that. So again, it had, even though it looks like messy areas of color and just sort of splashes of color, it has content in it. He's doing it in a way that he thinks he can express what is life's like in terms of spiritual qualities. So even when it's not objective, it doesn't mean, that it doesn't have content. Now let me just get past this since we already talked about it. Okay. Why is it still doing that? Come on, move. Okay. What I was talking about in terms of the dog, the shoes, the fruit, the candle up here, all of this in art history is called disguised symbolism. And what that means is that on the outside, these objects just look like any ordinary object that we could see. But they have this underlying meaning, this disguised sort of meaning. And this was just an approach that artists used at this period of time. We don't necessarily use it today. And so we might, in fact, if we didn't understand all the disguised symbolism, we might interpret this in a totally different way than that art historian that knew more about this period of time. And that's really not wrong. Artists are aware that once they've painted something and once they hang it for the public to look at, they know not everybody's going to understand it in the same way. Everybody's going to have personal interpretations of it. And why is that? What might be the reason? Why will each interpret things differently?
Culture?
Yeah. Well, and even be more specific than that. Examples, you're educated differently. You have different interests. Your family has different beliefs. Some people are Catholic, some people are Protestant, some people are Jewish. You'll have different religions. And so people will interpret things differently, and artists have to be aware that's going to happen. And some artists don't mind. It's fine. I painted it and it meant this to me, but I don't care if it means something else to you. I'm just happy it means something to you. Some artists don't like that. Some artists want you to see it exactly like they see it, but I think those artists are mistaken. It can't happen. Artists are, not every person in every period of time is going to interpret your work in exactly the same way. And so that brings us to another word that your textbook gives you, and that is context. And what context means, it means that in interpreting things, you relate it to things that you know. And, the best way, if you're looking at something old like this, is to understand that period of time and to know, what the symbolism was and to know how people acted and the politics, to know all of those things that make up the context when it was painted. But it also does leave it open to you bringing what you know to it and in interpreting it in your way. Your author mainly talks about the connections with the period of time when it was painted. But that is, that in a way limits you to, your knowledge that you have at that period. And so you can also bring your own period into it and interpret it in that way. So context just means, taking a period of time and pulling out of it things that help you to understand what's going on in that work that influence the artist. No artist lives in a closet. So they're influenced by things. They're influenced by religion and politics and all the sorts of things that happen in the world. And that shows up in their painting, even when they don't know it sometimes. They're influenced by it, so it does come out. So it helps to understand, the context. And so, say you're going to you go to a museum and you see works like this, and you're thinking, oh my, I don't know what to do with it. What am I going to say? I hope nobody asks me any questions about this. Well, take the approach of, okay, look at the label, and the label's usually going to tell you when it was made. It's going to give a date, at least a sort of a date, something around when they think it was made. And then think to yourself, okay, what was happening there? What happened at that place at that time? What do I know about history, that happened at that time? And so bring in some of what you've learned from other sources in order to interpret it. There's also another kind of context that you can think about, and that's the physical setting where the art was placed. Because, a lot of times we see art in museums and it doesn't really tell us much about what was it made for, where was it originally. And here, for example, and this is in your textbook, you can take a look at it there. This is a painting called The Assumption of the Virgin Mary. That is, after her death, she is supposed to have been raised to heaven by Jesus. And here it is in the church where it still exists today. So looking at it in a museum where maybe next to it is a portrait and on the other side is a still life, you lose the context. You lose part of why it was important and why it was made, because you don't see it in a museum the way you would have seen it if you saw it in the church. The church, you become affected by the surroundings, in other words, of works of art. And in some ways, it's nice that things are in museums. That way we can see them in the United States without having to go to Europe. But in some ways we lose a lot. We lose the idea that, people that would come to this church in the High Renaissance period and sit in the pews, would stare up at this vision of the Virgin Mary. And it really expressed one of their beliefs. And it must have touched their heart. They must have responded very emotionally to this work. But when you don't see it in the context, you don't get the same feeling for it. So that's another kind of context that we miss a lot of times. And so sometimes when you're in a museum, if you're looking at a work like this, try to think, okay, where would it have been placed when it was first made? It wasn't made for this museum. It must have been made for some other place. What kind of place might it have been, and how would that other setting have affected how people looked at this particular object? Context is understood by artists, and in the 20th century, a number of artists really played with this idea that context often influences how you interpret a work of art and what you think of it. And this artist is a really good example of a man who thought about how context affects how people see objects, whether they interpret them as art or not. This is a pile of bricks. Its subtitle is The Bricks. That's all it is. It's a pile of bricks that this artist placed inside of an art gallery. Now it's in a museum. And he knew that the context, that it was an art museum, was going to affect how people would look at this. And that they would walk up and, some people will look at it and say, oh, art. And why do they think that? Not because really there's anything there in the object that tells them. It's because it's in a museum. And so they think, oh, anything that I'm going to see in this museum must be art. Other people, some that are more cynical about it, they'll say, that's art. And they'll have a lot more questions about it. But he knew that the context that he placed these things would affect how people looked at him. If we saw this pile of bricks outside of a museum on the street corner, we'd probably say, oh, somebody must be constructing something, and here's a pile of bricks that they're going to be using. We wouldn't see it as art. And he understood that. And so he really was analyzing and trying to play with that idea of what makes something art. You know, is it just where it's placed, or is it something else about it that makes it art? Okay, we better stop right here, and we'll finish up on this lecture next time.